Hey everyone, this is my quest to build the best form library for React. My name is Kevin. I've got quite a few years in the industry, and I also work at Minted. Normally this doesn't matter, but they let me build a form library. Actually, they let me architect a form library. The big question you're probably asking is, why? Why would you create a whole new form library? We had a big project coming up with some complex dynamic forms, and we didn't like the existing form libraries. We had all these requirements to deal with. Like, we had a component library that we had to make sure these form components are compatible with. We had maintenance across all of our projects. We wanted a clean and simple API. We didn't want to bloat the bundle. We needed good documentation. Choosing a form library has to have good docs so people can use it. Performance was key because we'd run into problems in the past. So you're probably thinking, all the form libraries are already there. They're like really good, right? There's no problem with them. Like, why are you building your own form library? So there's ReduxForm. The creator of ReduxForm created React Final Form. Basically, this is a dead project, but I used it years ago, and many people probably did. It was a very popular library, and it was kind of the only thing around, and it used Redux, which was great because many projects with React used Redux at the time. There were all these great things about it. The problem is it just didn't last. It was very confusing to use. It had some weird issues with it, and it just became easier to write other libraries. That's where React Final Form came from, and that uses observables and derived state. Sadly, it has render props, which I don't personally like because I see them as a major performance problem. It forces your children components to re-render, and then you have to do a virtual DOM diff in React. It's not necessarily good to have render props, and that's why hooks have come about, because they can get around those limitations in some ways. This is really the spiritual successor to ReduxForm, and at least it uses observables. The next one is Formik, that you've probably heard of. There's like 100 ways of doing the same thing in Formik. I don't understand why. I went through, I looked at their docs, tried to figure out what's the way you build something. Every time I clicked on a link, I found a completely different way of building it. I was like, fine, I'll just show multiple ways of doing the same thing. The thing is, they don't describe for what reason you're going to use what API. That's a little bit of a problem here. With Formik, they do use render props as well. And what I'm talking about with render props is these things here, like where your children in a component is a function. If you can see here, all of this stuff can be compressed to this in OneForm, which is the library that I built. I'm not kidding either. All of this stuff in here, all these little metas is actually happening over here. You just can't see it. There's also a problem with these render props in general because there's a lot of boilerplate. Every single time you want to make a new field and you want to wrap your input, you got to put all this code every single time. It clutters up your code. It makes it harder to read. You can't really tell if somebody like renamed this or changed one thing here. You're not really going to know. All this boilerplate is not really giving you any benefit. And the way you would run Formik in your application, I'm assuming this is how most of you would do it because this is the way I've only ever seen it. You're going to have to wrap your components in Formik, and then you're going to have to tightly couple Formik to your form components, which is not necessarily what you're wanting. There's another way you can use Formik where they control the state and fields. With this one here, I was looking at this, and at first sight, I was like, how do I add my own component here? The way you do it is there's a component prop or a children or a render prop. Basically, you're still doing render props. This is not necessarily what you want, but the cool thing is you can get an API that kind of looks like this, but there's a lot less going on here. You have to format your components to match their API. They also don't memoize anything. I went through their source code just to be 100% sure. They still don't memoize anything. None of these components here are memoized. The problem with that is anytime some component outside of this re-renders, all of those inside will also re-render. And that's not necessarily what you want. There's another Formik API that I found, and they're probably more than this. These are the only ones I could find. I was just trying to learn how you're supposed to do Formik, and I found all these different examples. But here's another one where it has Formik. It's like a use Formik hook. What's going on is you control the form now, which means you're controlling the state, and you're passing in all these pieces into every input. It looks pretty clear. It's really explicit. I think it's a neat syntax. The problem with it is anytime anything update, any value, any error, any whatever that comes from this Formik, all of the components that use Formik are going to re-render. That's really not what you want. That's a performance no-no. I don't think this really scales because if every time you have to add these every single time, I don't think that's going to scale very easily. Think about it like this. Let's say you have dynamic values. You have values that aren't just first name, or say you have 5 first names. How are you going to manage it in here? Is it going to be first name with array 0? Or from first look, I can't just tell you. React hook form is another alternative, and I do like this one in some ways. The thing is, they do some weird stuff, but this is what they do. So they have a use form hook, and that's really the only React in this whole library. Then they have this register function, and you do like ... register. It passes props into your input. Now, if you want to pass props to input yourself, like you want to pass an on change or something else, you have to pass them in the second arg to register. Instead of using React, JSX, and passing props into a component, you're going to be passing an object inject into their function. And they're going to pass those props eventually to your component. That's kind of weird like that. Also, it's hard to tell what's coming from register. What is it putting in your input? I'm not sure. But they actually grab the ref on your input. So they actually need access to the input element or the select element or something else that's in base HTML element. They need access to the DOM reference to it. They can't just use React. It's built completely outside of React. I know it's kind of hard to like imagine because they have this thing here, but all this does is call a bunch of JavaScript that's outside of React. They're doing their own on-change listeners and all that stuff with window.add event listener. They're doing that kind of stuff behind the scenes. They're not passing an on-change into here and listening for it. This is my first impression. I literally took this right from their docs. I was like, man, I can't really tell what's going on here, but I finally read it and spent some time with it. This is what I was talking about. Here's the second arg. They're passing the props that normally go on an input component. They're passing it into a register function, and then the register function is going to be taking those and passing it into your input component. But I underscored the errors here. Something to keep in mind with these errors is that every time errors updates, everything will re-render again. This library, he talks about, oh, you type in an input and only that input gets updated. Yes, but when you have an error, everything gets updated because this form state here is a global form state, and that's in your form component here. When you're accessing this from useForm, which makes me think anytime useForm updates, it also updates all this stuff. I'm not exactly sure about that piece. What I do know is that the register function does not itself update, but this errors thing does, and that would force this to re-render. Minted weddings, we had wedding websites with Minted. We still do. That's where I started at the company. We had an existing form component library. It was home rolled and it had some quirks to it, but I thought it was a decent pattern. So I improved it with observables and hooks. We needed the observables for performance because it used context in React, but it's like old school context, but it still was context. And observables, what they can do is they can make it so that your context doesn't update unless the observable updates. You make the context once and never update it again. This pattern got used later. We wanted to, at Minted, make a library that was similar to what we had with this wedding websites. What we ended up doing was making Minted forms. Now, I architected this solution and somebody else built it. The reason for that is I was working on something way more complicated, and it was something that not really many people could do themselves, so I ended up building that myself. Minted Forms had some logistical issues. It was built specifically for the forms at Minted. It was closed source, it didn't have any unit tests, and there was no time to add extra functionality. The thing is that I wanted to add a bunch of stuff to it, and I didn't really have time to allocate at the company to do that because it's designed for Minted. So even if we wanted to open source it, how am I going to maintain this? I have to do it on my own time. But all the code is in Minted. So there was like one form component that had like 90% of the logic, and there was that use field hook, took it from the wedding websites library and used it here, and that had the observable thing. So we had the observable and we had like one component. There were some problems with it, but the API was sound. It had a very, very clean API. What you see today from OneForm is very similar to Minted Forms. I got permission from Minted to make my own library, and I built OneForm. And this was built completely from scratch. We didn't use anything from Minted. It's got improved functionality. It's got unit tests, integration tests. This is exactly what I wanted to build, and it has all that extra functionality that I wanted to do before for a more generic purpose. I have a YouTube channel, and most of my videos right now are me building OneForm, and you can see all the videos of how I did it. I've already built it. I have 42 videos. Just 19 of them are out today. I had to do a lot of planning for OneForm, and I didn't code it until day 2, and I really wanted to. I already kind of knew what I was doing. I had the same API I'd already worked on with Minted Forms, but I had to do the code behind the scenes from scratch. I planned a lot with this. I came up with all my ideas, figuring out exactly what I wanted to build and how to put it together. It wasn't until the second day where I actually started putting code in. But don't forget here is that because I'm building something from scratch, there's no existing structure, right? I don't have any components to work with. I don't have a repo, no process, no testing libraries, nothing. I didn't even have a DOM. It was just hooks at first. It wasn't such a big deal to test it, but I built it with Jest. This was built with hooks first. The reason I did it with hooks first was so I could unit test it. Now, instead of having no unit tests, we're going to have everything tested. The only real way to test hooks in React is actually to test the hooks themselves. Even if you have useState and useEffect and those things in React, the only way to test it is just to test the component rendering. That's not really testing your hooks. If you pull that logic out and put it into a separate hook, then you can actually unit test the hook by itself. As you see here, I do have a unit test on the screenshot here of that, but I've also tested some components and things. I'm not really fond of unit tests personally. I like integration tests more, but I understand the value of unit tests. And especially with this project, it was really important to build unit tests because it allowed me to actually test the hooks before I built any components. Jest has this thing where you do -- watch when you run it, and it allows you to press these letters here. That was extremely helpful for me. I could just sit there and run only the tests that I needed to run. I could run only failed tests, for instance. So if you just press the F key, it'll run only failed tests. If you press the O key, it'll only do your changes since last time. If you press A, it does all the tests. So it's really easy to just quickly run different groups of tests and different configurations when I'm developing, because this is my DOM, right? This is my UI, is Jest. Eventually, I did need a UI because I needed to test the actual components when I built them. I use Storybook for that. I actually advocate using Storybook in your application code. I think it's a great way to visualize as the individual components that you're building. It's easier to test the UI when all you have to test is like this one little configuration instead of 20 other things going on at the same time. It provides a state or a snapshot of your code at a specific point in time with a configured set of props. You can change those props in Storybook, but I didn't need to for this project. It looks like this is all I have, but there's way more in here. If you open up this field thing, there are about 20 more, and each one of these has more stories in it. I used Storybook extensively on this project, and the main reason I used it was because I could use Cypress to test it. Instead of just doing just test, I can also test DOM interaction with the browser, and I can use Cypress to do that. This is what it looks like. On the right here, we have the iframe from Storybook. So if you look back here, this segment right here is an iframe in Storybook. And then over here, I was able to grab that URL for the iframe and modify the visit command in Cypress so that when you go to a URL, it goes to the iframe of that component. And I was able to run all my tests. And there's tons of tests here. I mean, at the point I took this there were only 33, but there are way more than that now. This is how I did that. Cypress has a lot of advantages. You can actually run the Chrome debug tools in here. You can run it in Chrome. You can run it in Firefox, anywhere else. It also records videos as it does runs, and it takes screenshots. Because it is in the browser, I'm able to put breakpoints in it and debug if something's weird. I can just say, okay, I want to just look at this one, or I want to, as you see here, I clicked it and there's a little pin icon. That shows the state at this point in time in the tests. It takes DOM snapshots as it's going through to do that. Now, there's also extensive documentation in OneForm. I use these docs myself. That's how good they are. I don't know sometimes, what was I building there? What was I doing? It's not like I'm doing form work every day. My coworkers have to use these docs, so they have to be pretty decent. You also made it so that every example is able to be copy-pasted. If you see here, there's an import and there's an export. That's important because then you can just take this and pop it in your code base and you can run that component directly. This to me is really important. I watched some guy on YouTube talking about how he did docs for Twilio. That's what they said they did. And I was like, that's a really good idea because people are just going to copy paste. They're going to go to the docs. They're not going to read anything. They're going to copy paste it. I made sure that the docs are set up so that you can copy paste them. Now, the problem with copy pasting docs is you need to test them. My sister and I went through and copied all of them in here in Code Sandbox and we tested them all. The only reason I used Code Sandbox instead of putting them in my actual repo is because with Code Sandbox, you can have multiple people edit the same project at the same time. So we were both able to edit the code and add new things and test them without any problems. It got weird when something errored because I wouldn't know if it was her or me. We had to comment out these examples until we found the one that was broken. Now let's actually look at the architecture that I built. To me, it's super clean. It's also built with compound components. If you don't know what compound components are, they allow consumers to handle the rendering, and then the components that you're providing them secretly share a state together. The best example of this is a tab component. With a tab component, you would have tabs at the top, and you would have content at the bottom. Based on the tab you select, it will change the content. What if they ask you, hey, I want to be able to render the tabs on the bottom? What you're going to do in your tab component is you're going to add a prop that says position, and it's going to have top, and then it's going to have bottom. That way you can change where the tabs go. They're either up here or they're down here. But that's not how you build it with compound components. So the problem with that is it doesn't scale, because then they're going to ask you to do something else, and then it's going to compilate your components. You're going to end up having 50 props, and they have all these permutations, and you're never going to be able to test it. The best way to do that kind of thing with the position top and bottom is to have the tabs as a component and the tab content as a separate component, and then you can render them in whatever orientation you want in your application, and they still share that state behind the scenes. No matter what, when you click that tab, it will change the content. This is what OneForm looks like. Yes, it's this clean, and to me, this is a beautiful API. I like it because it's so easy to look at and understand, and all the boilerplate is gone, but also this is valid. You can actually run it like this. This input is controlled by field. Now, it doesn't look like it. It doesn't look like there's anything happening here. Obviously, you can't submit this form. It's not going to do anything, but you can edit the input, and the input is controlled by field, and OneForm has the state of this input. Probably wondering what field is doing. How does this work? I'm using something in React called clone element, and that allows you to clone the child. Essentially, you're creating a new object. Think about when you have that ... and you're putting props into an object and you're creating a new object. That's the same thing that this clone element is doing. It does not delete the props on the child. Well, I would say it overwrites them, but it will add to them. So it'll append more props. For instance, in this example, this is just field in a nutshell. There's a lot more going on in the actual field component, but here's a really simple example. There's a use field hook. It takes the name off of your children. You can only have one child element per field, but as long as it has a name prop, then we have access to it. It doesn't have to be an input, it could be anything, but as long as it has a name prop, then we pass that to use field. Then it gives us an on change in value, and we take those and we put them into your child element. In the actual OneForm, this use field can handle a bunch of special cases, like checkboxes, radio buttons, select, and multi-select. That's really neat, but you're probably thinking, oh, you can do that? You can do this clone thing and have this clean API? Yes. There are some issues with it, though. For instance, this is the same issue React Hook Form has, though. You can't tell where the props props are coming from, what props are field passing to input. And it also doesn't tell you what props field cares about from input. It doesn't tell you it cares about the name. There's some understanding you have to use this, but also you can't have anything required, at least for prop types. TypeScript's a little bit different. If you don't put an onChange on your input component, and your input component, like your custom one, and it says, oh, onChange is required, that will error because React is going to render that input and then clone it after it's done rendering. What you want to do is make the onChange function optional, then you won't have this problem. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, oh, but it shouldn't be optional. Yeah, it should actually. Just put a no-op function as the default value. That's actually not a bad thing to do because your component won't break if there's no onChange function. It just won't work the way you're expecting. But that's not what is required is for. Is required is supposed to be, if you don't pass this, it will break. It just won't work. If you have it optional, then like you can choose to pass it or not. And that's where this is coming from. Now, there are benefits to this API as well. The props go in your input and not in your field. If I needed to add an onChange or anything like that, if I need to add, let's say like a data property or something that's special to my component, I add that on the input and not on the field. To me, that's really important because typically with that example of Formik that I showed earlier, you would pass all your props in field. And then you can't tell which are the props that field cares about and which are the props that input cares about. I don't know. They're all going into field. And you can't really refactor that either. This also removes all that boilerplate. Initially, you have this render props boilerplate. That's all gone now from my competitor field. And so because there are no render props, you're getting rid of all that boilerplate. It gives you the same access to context. This is a far cleaner API that gives you the same behavior, but without all this crap. You don't need any hooks either. They don't need this use field hook like everybody else has. Yeah, I'm using it internally, but you guys don't have to use it. Now all you got to deal with is components and not stuff outside of components. Everything in the state should be there in your JSX, and it should be pretty easy to follow. It's all about trade-offs. The other libraries also made trade-offs. Formik has a trade-off where they don't care about performance, or at least it's lower down on their radar. Because of that, they can do different kinds of APIs, but it's a trade-off. And in my library, the trade-off is I want it to look clean and I want it to do everything for you. That is the trade-off. Material UI, if you ever heard of this is a popular React UI library. It's a nicer alternative to Bootstrap. It uses compound components and it has many, many form components. So I was interested to see how this would work with OneForm. It just works. It was really nice. I imported a bunch of stuff. I tested it out. I had a little form here. All this validation, this is built into OneForm. This is all OneForm here. There's no external state and it just works. It was so cool. This is what it looks like. Material UI has a text field and you just pass text field to field. This is the same thing as with the input. As long as it has a name prop and accepts an onChange and a value, then you can use it. There weren't any special changes I need to make. Now, the thing is, I did have to make a special change. The reason is Material UI is doing something weird with text field that is undocumented. It might be something weird in version 4. I don't know. I was passing extra props to text field that Material UI didn't care about. Field passes quite a few props down. And if your component cares about them, it takes them. If not, it doesn't. But text field would then pass those props to the input underneath. The input was like, well, I don't know what these props are. And it started throwing console errors. It worked, but it would throw console errors. So I created this Material UI field to mitigate that. And you're thinking like, well, that sucks. Yeah, it does, but it's actually not that bad because we do the same thing at Minted today, where I had to create a component that is specific to our form components. Material UI has some special stuff. It has this helper text. That's not a common thing. I wouldn't expect to pass error messages in your helper text. And it's not just error messages, but this is an example that I used to show that. You can put these messages in your helper text. This is my translation. This is a function that you pass to the field component. You don't want to do it every single time. You're going to do it once and create a new component like I did, like this Material UI field, and then you're going to use that Material UI field anytime you wrap Material UI. Then you can know exactly what props are coming into it because you've defined what they are as a translation. So you don't have to use the native field. You can wrap the field almost like render props, except you're passing it a translation function, and then it's going to handle all that for you. Just making it easy so you don't have to have boilerplate. Performance still is there. I was showing before that you could pass just your props into your component, right? You're not passing them in the field. This is a good example. Even the onChange is important. OneForm will take that onChange and it will do its own stuff, and it will call your onChange again and pass the event back to you. If you want to do any kind of tracking, then this will allow you to do that. You can pass an onChange in here and it'll still get called even though OneForm is actually using this onChange in field. You're probably also wondering what the OneForm component is. OneForm is a context provider, and field and other components read from the context in OneForm. The context in OneForm is set once and never again. There are actually 7 contexts in OneForm, and that's mainly for organization and testing, but they don't ever update. They get set once. There are observables that get put on them, and observables are just objects, and then you have to call the subscribe on the observable to do anything. You can listen to values and get values and subscribe to it, but the contexts never update, meaning those components that listen to those contexts never get updates. They subscribe themselves to understand the segment of the state that they actually care about. This is actually getting around a problem with React in context to make it more similar to other state management libraries that are more granular and can update only based on certain changes. These are the props for OneForm. I literally took these from the docs. You're not going to use them all, but they're all here. Field, because it's a context consumer, can be deeply nested. It can be anywhere. So I show here there's a div around it. It doesn't have to be directly under the OneForm component. And field value is something that renders a string of the value of that field. How do you identify what a field is by the name. These are associated together. As you type in this input, it will show the value in field value. You don't have to do a use state or anything yourself to try to capture that. It's going to do it all for you. It's built in. This is where we're getting to the interesting part of OneForm. It's not really a form library. It's a state manager. Because it's a state manager, you have powerful state management tools that just happen to be specifically designed for a form library. These names are identifiers of state. You don't have to put strings in there either. You can put booleans, you can put objects, you can put arrays. We actually do need arrays for times when you have multi-selects. There are cases where you want different data types, and OneForm does not care. Whatever you put in there, it's going to be there. This is what the data structure looks like behind the scenes. It's flat. You have values and you have error messages. These are two data structures, and they map. The email key here will map to the email key here. They're one-to-one. Also notice the error messages is an array. Behind the scenes, there are a bunch of different states for errors. There's validation errors. There's group validation errors. They're the errors that you pass into the component. They're all stored separately inside of OneForm, but you'll just see a single array back of error messages. You can get multiple error messages for each field if you want to display multiple, or get the top one and then only display the top one. It's not a big deal. Here's an example of just displaying the top error message. Once that gets fixed, it'll remove itself and there'll be another one. This is a field error message component, and it's listening on name, and we're adding that to the helper text of text field. So this is with the regular field component that I had before, not my special one. What this allows you to do, because this returns a string, you can pass it as a prop to helper text here. It takes React nodes. This is going to return a React node, but the React node returns a string. This error message string will get passed to here, and it's only the first one. It's not the whole array. It's just the first error message. This is a helper that's in the library built in that allows you to just pull one error message and put it in here. If you want multiple, I don't have a solution for that. You would have to build that piece yourself, but the tools are there and it's not difficult. Because it's a state manager, we have conditional state. If field value, so if there is a first name, display the last name field. This is really powerful, but you're probably thinking, okay, but what if there's no first name? I need to put something else here. Well, it takes a fallback prop, and you can pass that in. That takes a component, and you can render that component if this doesn't exist. Same as you would with like suspense and some other libraries. There's also the capability of giving it a function and then checking what value you care about. For instance, we have a select box, and based on the value of that select box, you can then show the contents here. That's how powerful this is. You can say, oh, the value is custom, therefore render all these other fields or this other segment of code. I also built a spreadsheet app. This took only 4 hours to build, so it wasn't that long. I built this with OneForm entirely in OneForm's internal state, including this equal sign stuff. These aren't hard coded. I typed it in this field. When you click in the field, it swaps that value in there, and then you can start doing your equation. When you put the equals and whatever, it knows you're doing a calculation. It starts looking for keywords like sum and average. Then it's going to run that calculation. If you just type text in the field, there's going to be text in here. But if you have a special calculation, then when you click out, it's going to put the calculated value here, and it's going to take your other value up here. And it's actually using a trick in OneForm related to that name field where you can create states that don't exist on the DOM. It's kind of weird. I don't want to go too into depth with it, but if you change this 10 to 11, then this number over here is going to say 21. This is the sum of A1 and B1, which are these two fields. If I change this to 11, that'll be 21, and it'll update on the fly as you're typing it, which also means that you can do money calculations like this. I did use it on a side project. I can't show the screenshot because it was closed source, but I did a side project where I had a money thing, and as you hit the backspace, like this says like $400, you hit backspace, backspace, backspace. Well, normally that would just have a dollar sign, or it would remove all of the text in that field. They wanted it to have $0. If you keep hitting backspace, it's just going to eventually say $0. You can keep hitting it, but it'll just say $0. It won't delete the 0 and then re-add it either. It'll just say $0. It's really neat how it works. You can update the state of other fields based on something happening. When A1 updates, I'm able to update the value of C1. That's the crazy stuff that you can do with OneForm. It's really a state manager disguised as a form library. It also supports dynamic fields. This is something we actually use in Minted. This is the way that it internally stores those dynamic fields. These fields are all in the same person, but this person has 2 emails, so each email has its own ID. The way you do that is actually using a field group component. We originally didn't have this in Minted forms, but when I did OneForm, I added this to it. You pass it these props here. When this input gets read by OneForm, it's actually going to read it like this, which is the craziest thing. You're not passing anything. There's no props. There's no string manipulation. You put the field group here, and it's able to know in OneForm that, oh, there was a field group parent, therefore, this is my name. It can store those net values now separately in that flat data structure. This makes it very simple to deal with. I have tools here to break these apart. I'm working on the tools so that you don't have to write this yourself when you're submitting a form that has dynamic fields, because otherwise you have to break those values out yourself. I made it easy though. There's a slash, right? And there's a colon, and that's all you got to worry about. You can also deeply nest your field groups. So this is that email example from before. If you look here, this email is up here and this email is over here. There's a field group at the top with the person ID, and there's another field group inside it with email ID. Each email can be wrapped in a field group. That's how you can dynamically have fields that come out of nowhere. When I say dynamic fields, this is like you hit the add button on your field and it adds like a new email. The email has to have an ID to it, because when you go to write it to the database, you need to be able to identify that email from the other ones. Let's say you're bringing in values from your database and you're putting them in the form. As long as they have these IDs on them, then OneForm will know. You're not typing these in manually, by the way. These could be like GUIDs or something else you're generating on the fly. The point is that when you're running a loop, you can then pass the ID to the field group and the name of the group, and this email will just have it. If we go back to this, you see that there are two fields here. You can wrap those fields in a different component. You can move them somewhere else. You can have just two inputs. You can have whatever you want, and they can be separate from your field group. So you can render them in a form where you have to have dynamic versions of those, or you can render in a form where you only have the one. OneForm also has this concept of field registration. It also has a concept of visitation, which I didn't put in here, but visitation is a field has been visited. So if you clicked on it and then you clicked out, now it's been visited. Registration is where a field is mounted. That's the default behavior. You can change any of this if you want to, but the default behavior and the way I think it should be is that when a field is mounted in the DOM, then it is registered, and only registered fields are going to end up validating. Actually, you have to be registered and visited to validate. That's the default behavior. If you submit the form, then all fields are visited at that point. But also with submit, when you submit a form, you only care about the fields that are mounted in the DOM. It gives you access to both all of the fields in the DOM and just the registered fields. You can get two different states depending on what your needs are for your form. It's nice that it does the registered fields thing, because you don't necessarily want state from fields that don't exist anymore. Also with the validation, it's the same kind of thing. If you unmount a field, you don't want it to validate that field. That's why registration is important. You don't ever touch registration. Registration and visitation, those things, you won't touch manually. They'll just be there in the form. Field validation is built into OneForm. I'll show you what that looks like close up here. There's a password field. It has two different checks on it. These checks will both get run. That's why you can have multiple error messages. This is all statically defined. I'm not defining this for every single password field. I'm defining it in the OneForm component itself. These are the validations that go in there, and it's an object with the key. You don't have to put password / and some ID. You don't have to do any of that. If you put password, then every field that has a name of password will get validated in the same way. That's the expectation, is that based on the field name, all of these fields probably need similar validation. So it's able to do that, and it's able to do a little bit more with it. But in this function here, this get is valid function, you can use a regex, you can use yup, you can use anything you want. That makes it a little bit easier to create whatever you want for your validation that works for your company, but you can do it per field. You can also do it for multiple fields. As you see here at the top, I have field names. I'm subscribing to first name and last name, and this get error messages function will only run when either of those has changed and no other time. Again, performance is key. It only runs when it needs to. But this validation here, if you return false on last name, it says, okay, there's no validation. Great, there's no errors. If first name and last name are equal, then it's going to error on the last name field and say your first and last name cannot match. You're probably wondering how all this works, because you could pass in errors. You could have a validation for the last name field. How do you manage making sure that when the last name returns false here, it doesn't delete all the other validations? You don't want all the error messages. You only want these ones. OneForm is smart in that it actually keeps track of every single group validation that you pass in, and it keeps track of every validation you pass in, and it keeps track of the error messages that you're passing in the form. They're all separate pieces that it's able to look into. If this validation says that, okay, your first and last name cannot match, that's great, and then you fix it, it only removes this error message. The other error messages from other places are not being removed. You can also return an array here too. You don't have to just return one error message. Last name can take an array of error messages, and that's also fine. OneForm knows how to handle that. It's all because we're using observables behind the scenes that I can do all this crazy stuff. Is your mind blown? Why would you want to use OneForm? You want to use it because it has the Compound Components API. It manages state for you. It's reactive and fast, and it's used by Minted today. Is it the next big thing? Let's make it happen. Okay, cool. That's it.